Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm Anushka. I'm one of your Kitty Hawk tutors. And today we are going to go through some SAT questions as part of the English Module 1 worksheet. So for these questions, we're going to go through each of them. There are 10. We're going to talk about the correct answers and just discuss briefly why some of the other answers are incorrect. So this is a great place to check your work, get clarifications on why the correct answers are correct and why incorrect are incorrect, get a sense of what kind of questions you're getting right, which ones you're not, and understand what concepts you might need to revisit in preparation for the SAT. I will say just beforehand that some of these questions are quite a bit harder than most of the questions you will find in Module 1, but sometimes the difficulty level is mixed, and so I tried to replicate that as best I could. Alrighty. And I have some notes next to me, so if you see me looking over my shoulder, that's because I'm making sure I get my facts right. Alright, let's get started. So, question 1. A precursor to tennis, jeu de paume, which was a medal event in the 1908 Olympics, is an ancient French game played indoors in a court with a blank. The ball is volleyed between players without racket. Players use their hands. So the correct answer is D, net, but, with a comma. The answer, why this is the correct answer, is because if you look at this sentence, you see that we have an independent clause beginning, and then after our blank, we have a subject, the ball, and a verb, is volleyed. So we are starting a brand new independent clause. And how we would connect the two independent clauses is using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. In this case, our comma is, well, it's our comma, and our coordinating conjunction is but. However is not a coordinating conjunction. However is a conjunctive adverb. You could use however if you had a semicolon after net and then a comma after however, but you don't have that option. So the only coordinating conjunction that would work is D. A is missing the comma and C is using notably, which is an adverb. It doesn't fulfill our requirement. All right, problem 2. Let me just get a sip of water real quick. The following text is from Jane Austen's 1811 novel Sense and Sensibility. Elinor lives with her younger sisters and her mother, Mrs. Dashwood. Elinor, this eldest daughter, whose advice was so effectual, possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counselor of her mother and enabled her to frequently counteract the advantage of them all, that eagerness of mind in Mrs. Dashwood, which must generally have led to imprudence. She had an excellent heart, her disposition was excellent, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved to never be taught. According to the text, what is true about Elinor? So the correct answer to this question is D. Elinor is remarkably mature for her age. And there are a couple phrases that kind of give it away. She possessed a strength of understanding, a coolness of judgment. She's only 19, but she's her mother's counselor. She had an excellent heart, a good disposition. She had strong feelings, but she knew how to control them. All those phrases kind of indicate that she is emotionally intelligent, she is sensible, she is reserved, remarkably mature is the right phrase. Now, the other ones are incorrect for some other reasons. There is no mention of her arguing with her mother. It says that she counteracts her mother's rashness, meaning she prevents her mother from making hasty decisions. But that's not the same thing as arguing with her mother and trying to change her mind. B is incorrect because it is mentioned that she has strong feelings, but she knows how to govern them. So overly sensitive is not what we're going for. And C, there's no mention of Elinor's opinions of other people or her judgments. So, yeah, that's incorrect. All right, number 3. Sonic Youth, figureheads of New York experimental rock, were seldom far from my turntable in the 1980s and 1990s. I, and like friends, pored over their blank when it came out in 1988. The answer to this question is C, and this is a question that actually stumped me at one point, which is why I felt like it was important to include here. This comes back to something called the appositive rule, which is something you might have learned in grammar once upon a time or not. Essentially, how an appositive works. An appositive is when two nouns sit next to each other and they refer to the same thing. So masterpiece is referring to Daydream Nation, and daydreamation is the masterpiece, right? See how that works. When you have an essential appositive, that means the second noun is necessary to specify the first one. So daydreamation is specifying which masterpiece. That's why we have to have it. But when you have an essential appositive, there's no comma between the two of them. So that is why our correct answer is C, because this is an example of an essential appositive. All right, moving on to number 4. To prevent some conflicts of interest, Congress could prohibit high-level government officials from accepting positions as lobbyists for 3 years after leaving government service. One such official concluded, however, that such a prohibition would be unfortunate because it would prevent these government officials from working for 3 years. Clearly, the official thinks that would. Okay, the trick with this question, and by the way, the answer is C, but the trick with this question is to identify what is the hidden assumption in the situation. So there is a ban that they're proposing, and it says that government officials who are retiring or leaving cannot work as lobbyists for 3 years after leaving. And this government official is going, oh, that means we can't work for 3 years. So what's the assumption there? It's that if they leave, the only job they can have is as a lobbyist. So that's a little subtle, but once you pick up on it, it's pretty clear. Why are the other ones incorrect? Okay, well, A, lobbyists play a vital role. There's no relation between lobbyists and legislation anywhere in this passage. B is talking about what Congress does or doesn't want. It's asking what the official thinks, not what Congress might have, mentioned. And C is far more obvious. The duration is too short for D. No, there's no mention of any thoughts about how long or short the ban is. All right, moving on to number 5. So, Estonia, Spain, and the other member nations of NATO share a commitment to the principle of collective defense. Each NATO member blank to defend the others if necessary. So, something to notice right off the bat, this is a complete independent clause. We have our subjects, Estonia, Spain, member nations of NATO. We have a verb, share. We have an object, which is commitment. So anything after the comma cannot start a full new sentence unless there's a conjunction, like but or so. But we don't have any of those as answer choices. So the second part has to be a modifier that's adding information about our object commitment. And the only modifier that makes sense in this case, or the only verb form that makes sense, is pledging, because it is a present participle, which makes this a participle phrase. This phrase is adding extra detail, it's modifying each NATO member, and it's not creating a second independent clause, which is the most important thing. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, moving on to number 6. I gotta read this out loud. Yippee. Alrighty, so text 1. Astronomer Mark Holland and colleagues examined 4 white dwarfs, small, dense remnants of past stars, in order to determine the composition of exoplanets that used to orbit those stars. Studying wavelengths of light in the white dwarf atmospheres, the team reported that traces of elements such as lithium and sodium support the presence of exoplanets with continental crusts similar to Earth. Okay, take that in. Then text 2. Past studies of white dwarf atmospheres have concluded that certain exoplanets had continental crusts. Geologist Keith Peterka and astronomer C. Xu argue that those studies unduly emphasize atmospheric traces of lithium and other individual elements as signifiers of the types of rocks found on Earth. The studies don't adequately account for the different minerals made up of various ratios of those elements, and the possibility of rock types not found on Earth that contain those minerals. So based on the text, Howard, Peterka, and Xu characterize the conclusion in text 1. So the one thing that I would recommend for these kind of text comparison, make sure you understand what each text is saying on their own. So text 1 is essentially saying that these astronomers found traces of elements like lithium and sodium, and they are saying that these traces of elements mean these exoplanets have continental crusts like Earth's. So they're basically linking a causation right there. Text 2 is saying that yes, there are traces of lithium and other elements found in these continental crusts, but that doesn't automatically mean that that is the same rock type as what's found on Earth. there could be different minerals made up of different ratios of those elements, and those could be different rock types themselves. So hopefully you eliminated A and D right away because unexpected and puzzling are not the right descriptors in this context. The correct answer is C, as questionable, because it rests on an incomplete consideration of potential sources of the elements detected in one dwarf atmosphere. Remember, this is where that last part of text 2 is really important. They don't adequately account for the different minerals. There are different mineral sources that could have different ratios or different ratios of those elements. So what it's saying is that they haven't realized that there could be other minerals that are giving you those elements, not necessarily the same ones that you have in Earth's crust. And that is why C is correct. B, it does say that they are determining what kind of crust, but then if you look at the first line of text 2, past studies have concluded that certain exoplanets had continental crusts. So there is already some study that's going on. It's not necessarily just begun trying thing. So the answer is C. And that one is pretty tricky, so pat on the back. All right. Number 7. In Yellowstone National Park, the renowned Old Faithful Geyser spews hot water and steam into the air periodically. Rhythmic eruptions from this blank attract tourists from all over the world. Okay, I think the question has attract in it already, so that shouldn't be there. But the correct answer to this question, let me just make sure, is C. Or, hang on, that's the correct answer. It's B, my bad, looking at the wrong question. The answer is B, and let's go through it. So notice that the verb is related to rhythmic eruptions. So you have parks, features, and attract. So the feature belongs to the park. That's why you're going to have a comma for B, right? That's the possessive comma, right? Not comma. It's the what is it called? 1 second. Yeah, it's possessive. That's why that's the is that an apostrophe? The girl is losing all vocabulary today, but it is B because of that. The feature belongs to the park. And then attract is coming from rhythmic eruption. So that's where you have to match the plurality of the subject and the verb. So rhythmic eruptions is plural. That's why we're not going to have attracts. We're going to have attract. The tricky part with this question is if you confuse park's feature. So if you think that feature is what is the subject for attract, which is not the case. So read this question carefully and these types of questions because they're just messing around with the subject and verb agreement. Sorry for being a little all over the place. All right, moving on. We have another big text question, problem 8. All right, text 1. What factors influence the abundance of species in a given ecological community? Some theorists have argued that historical diversity is a major driver of how diverse an ecological community eventually becomes. Differences in community diversity across otherwise similar habitats in this view are strongly affected by the number of species living in those habitats at earlier times. Okay, take that in. Text 2. In 2010, a group of researchers, including biologist Carla Caceres, created artificial pools in a New York forest. They stocked some pools with a diverse mix of zooplankton species and others with a single zooplankton species, and allowed the pool communities to develop naturally thereafter. Over the course of 4 years, Caceres and colleagues periodically measured the species diversity of the pools, finding, contrary to their expectations, that by the end of the study there was little to no difference in the pool species diversity. So something to notice, the first text is saying that if you have a historically diverse area, it's more likely to be diverse, right? But text 2, you have 2 areas starting off with clear different diversity, right? The first one has lots of zooplankton species and the other with a single one. And then in the long run, they had very similar measures of diversity. So A is not correct, because it's clearly not correct. B, it is not compelling as a theory, regardless. Whenever you see something like regardless of any experimental data, that is a bit too strong to be a correct answer. So B is wrong. C is our correct answer. It may seem plausible, but the most important thing is it is not supported by text two. And D is it probably holds true. That's not correct. There's no saying that it's just in those conditions. Yeah, I'm trying to think if they're clearer explanation. Yeah. It doesn't hold true in text two for sure. So, and text one, it's not clearly saying that it's always true. So, yeah, probably not a great word. All right. Problem 9. Harlem artist Faith Ringgold explored many media in her career, but is most famous for narrative, I should say quilts. Why does it say quilts? Quilts that allowed her to break away from Western painting. Blank. Let her express, I shouldn't say expressions, let's say express. Express her feminist tendencies by rolling them up and carrying them rather than having a man help her load them into a truck. Sorry for some of the spelling errors here. I think the autocorrect got a little carried away. But the answer to this question is A, traditions and according to Ringgold. So if you have, if you look at this question, you see that there are two parallel verbs describing what the quilts did. They allowed her to break away from traditions and they let her express her feminist tendencies. So what we need is a type of structure that connects the two verbs with and then correctly inserts the interrupting phrase according to Ringgold, because according to Ringgold is an interrupting phrase. So A is correct because of that. According to Ringgold is something called a non-essential interrupter. So it needs commas on both sides. And that's what helps keep a smoother structure. The other ones are just messing around with comma placement and testing whether or not you know about this non-essential interrupter grammar rule. So if that's something you haven't encountered before, definitely take a look at it. Comma before and actually breaks the verb parallelism, so that's why you don't want it there. Comma splits the main verb structure, basically. And you need a comma on either side to set it off, so that's why some of the others might be wrong. All right, last question. Question 10. Following the principles of community-based participatory research, tribal nations and research institutions are equal partners in health studies conducted on reservations. A collaboration between the Crow tribe and Montana State University blank this model. Tribal citizens worked alongside scientists to design the methodology and continue to assist in data collection. Okay, first thing for questions like this, make sure you have reviewed the SAT vocab list, because I think this one is not so bad, but there are some questions, some practice questions, especially in Module 2, where they will give you some rather obsolete vocab. And you want to make sure that you have looked at those vocab lists and you're familiar with them, because those are fairly easy points and you want to make sure you get them. So here we go. Essentially, we need a verb when you look at this that means it's an example of or it demonstrates, right? And the clear answer is D, exemplifies. Yeah, hopefully we are familiar with the meanings of circumvents, right? To kind of avoid or go around. Fabricate is to make up. Eclipse is to kind of overshadow. But exemplifies is the one that fits perfectly because it is saying that this is an example of, this is a demonstration of, so that is exactly what you want in this context. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. And yeah, thank you for listening and best of luck with your SAT preparation.